Welcome to the To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes, and welcome to week number 4 of the Trump administration 2.0. Okay, so Tom, seriously, it can't just be 4 weeks, right? I mean, 3 weeks. It's got to be. We're in a time warp now, right?
I sort of figured it was already time for the 2028 elections. I mean, it's been a lifetime.
My God. But I you know what? I will not read any articles about the 2028 election. It is just too early. Hey, welcome back to my good friend Tom Nichols, staff writer for The Atlantic, long-time friend, you know, and it's good. It's good to see you and talk with you, Tom. I appreciate
you too,
it.
Charlie.
I mean, one of the experiences of the last few years has been, of course, to be that wonderful experience of being unpersoned, and you cannot overestimate the number of people who will ghost you over the years. And I have to say that, Tom, you have been one of the people who have, what's the opposite of ghosting? Unghosting. You've been a good friend. So
friendship.
I'm glad to have you back. So yes, something like that. Okay. So let me just do a lightning round with you because you're an expert in foreign affairs before we get to Elon Musk and the enshittification of the rule of law and all of those other things. Okay. So in the next 4 years, will the United States, and then these are just yes or no questions, okay? I don't want deep thoughts. Is that okay with you, Tom? I mean, okay.
Okay. This feels like one of those scenes in Law and Order. That's a yes or no question, sir.
It is a yes or no question.
All right.
Okay. U.S. take over Canada as a 51st state, yes or no?
It will not. No.
Okay. Take over Panama.
No.
Okay. Take over Gaza.
Wow. I'm gonna say no.
No,
but
but
that's
you're
a weaker right. No.
And seize Greenland as part of our manifest destiny.
Yeah, no.
Okay,
none
so
of those things are going to happen.
The reason I'm asking these questions is, you know, the president has spent a great deal of time in between. And by the way, I'm not trying to get distracted here. In between, you probably noticed this is tariff week again. He has stopped the production of pennies. He's re-endorsed plastic straws, took time out from being the leader of the free world to tweet mean shit to Taylor Swift. What am I forgetting? Oh, and seized control of the Kennedy Center. And it's like, okay.
Clearly, kitchen table issues in the heartland. You know,
that's
how many times,
that's what they wanted in Michigan.
You know, when you were traveling out there or during the 2024 election, did they go into a small diner in Pennsylvania and someone said, you know what really pisses me off? The Kennedy Center board.
Yeah. It's the Kennedy Center board. And so what's the, if the Kennedy administration was Camelot, what is this, like the un-Camelot? We're just going to bring in, I mean,
I don't know. Can you imagine? I'm not a Lord of the Rings fan, but I'm sure there's like some scary place in Lord of the Rings that's the opposite of Camelot. This is, but you know, it's, let's not make it too grandiose. I mean, there's also just this kind of comic opera.
Well, this is right.
You know, you could say, oh, this is, you know, the valley of death and the dark place. And yeah, I mean, it is because we're a superpower that is slowly committing suicide in public. But
sounds bad.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're not committing suicide. We're not going to cease to exist, but we're parceling out what power and reputation we once had. I mean, every time I see Trump I was watching the news earlier and there's a picture of him shaking hands with Xi Jinping, and I just keep thinking these guys must go home. Back to Moscow and Beijing and other places and say, this is amazing that the Americans are doing this to themselves on purpose. But there's also just this, I mean, I still have trouble saying the words Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
I don't think I'll ever get over that.
DNI nominee Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, there is just a kind of, it's a joke I've used before, but not with you, Charlie, so I'll say it again, which is this whole cabinet feels like a Saturday Night Live cold open, you know, where you're in the writer's room and someone says, okay, so here's the cold open. So we do, you know, a future Trump administration, and it's Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard and Cash Patel. And you can almost see Lorne Michaels or somebody saying, oh, no, let's not get crazy. Let's.
Well, I mean, at this point, I think the great mystery is how come Laura Loomer doesn't have a position in the cabinet? I mean, is there anybody? How come Steve Bannon is not chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? I mean, and you go,
Mike
ha
Flynn.
ha ha. Mike Flynn, he's back there. So no, I mean, the reason I'm throwing out this stuff, and I think you go to it, is that how do we, this is part of our job, isn't it, to separate out just the distractions, the endless flooding the zone, just complete bullshit, from the stuff that is actually scary, but also to leaven the genuinely scary with the recognition that, yeah, this colossus who is, ruling America is also a really absurd clown surrounded by really, really absurd people. And the fact that he can't distinguish between the straws and taking over Greenland. So I mean, so how do we do this? We're still at the beginning. How do we adjust the dial? We pay attention to this. We ignore this. What? Thoughts?
That's a great question, and I think that would be really helpful. I mean, you and I do this for a living, so we pay attention to everything, and then we have to kind of right every morning. You get up and you sort of, I'm back to that old feeling of opening up my computer and going to the news and going, okay, now what? Most people don't have to do that, and I think one way is for I hate to sound like I'm arguing for disengagement, but there is something for most people to unplug just a little bit, and I'll use one example. You brought up the thing about not minting pennies. That's not a crazy idea. That could actually be a bipartisan. I mean, people have been talking about getting rid of the penny for a long time. Democrats and Republicans, that it doesn't really make sense. It's expensive to keep minting them. They don't, people don't really use them. I have a whole dish of them sitting downstairs. But if you're treating the potential that Trump is going to defy the courts, or that he's appointed completely unqualified people to lead our national security establishment, and if you're gonna take all that in and say, and what's this about the pennies? Most folks, don't react to every single thing, because the goal of this, and you and I have said this many times over the years, the goal is to exhaust people. It's to exhaust them into, it's to numb them into tuning out and kind of default compliance with whatever Trump wants to do. Just throw their hands up in the air and say, well, what are you going to do? It's Donald Trump.
Right. And I'm hearing a lot of that, and I really do understand this. Okay. So you and I haven't had this conversation, so I feel like we have a lot of catching up to do. You wrote a book about the death of expertise. When did that come out? 2018, 2019?
Actually, I finished it, and I want to put in a quick word here, because people think I wrote that about Trump. I actually started writing that around 2015, long before Trump was on, 2014, 2015. So it appeared in late 2016, early 2017.
So the death of expertise, it was a pretty dark, pessimistic book. But looking back on it, could you have imagined how much worse it was going to get? I mean, you made some predictions. I mean, I think in terms of the turn against vaccines, the fact that RFK Jr. is about to be Secretary of Health and Human Services at this point. I mean, let's leave aside the fact that he was a heroin addict and had brain worms and everything, and that he will be presiding over pandemics. I mean, could you ever have imagined that there would be this kind of an almost Luddite reaction?
When I wrote the first edition, I actually thought things were getting better. I thought, we've hit peak insanity about all this stuff. And I opened the second edition, which came out about 6 months ago, almost a year ago. And I said, okay, I made an expert prediction. I was wrong. I was wrong to think this was getting better. I had Charlie, I think the phrase is, I had a failure of imagination.
I think a lot of people did. They still do.
Yeah, I think I think that's absolutely right. I think a lot of people are still suffering from a failure of imagination about how bad this could get. But when it comes to the expertise issues, health, vaccines, national security, the Defense Department, the FBI, there was something in me that always said, look, this is at at heart, we're basically a sensible country. We have circuit breakers that kick in that
Right.
make sure that people like, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. never get near the levers of power, or that Tulsi Gabbard is never going to be at the top of the, and I just don't, I guess we're not. I guess we're not a sensible country.
Well, it's as if we broke the glass and then broke the next glass and kept going and going and going and going. But you do wonder how this is going to go. So over the weekend, one of the big stories was cutting back on NIH research. See, unfortunately, anytime we use acronyms, I think we're losing the debate. If we're talking about USAID, or we're talking about NIH. But the administration had something that I think has a surface appeal to conservatives who think that universities have too much money. They limited the amount of overhead that, say, the University of Wisconsin or the University of Alabama or the University of North Carolina can charge, right? And now we're hearing from all of these cancer researchers, all of these labs, even some Republican senators who are saying this is deadly. You're actually going to bring cancer research to a halt. So it feels like at the moment, I want to get your take on this, that people, there's this visceral thrill of breaking things, but people don't fully realize what is being broken. And so we have to go through that process.
And, it's interesting that when you tell people what's going on, I think you're never going to change the hearts and minds of the diehard MAGA movement types. But I think there's a lot of people who said, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't realize that's what that meant. Because most people, and I say this only partially with criticism and partially just because it's a fact, most people just don't know how anything in the government works. They don't understand how the National Institutes of Health get funded. They don't understand how cancer research gets paid for. And God bless them, most people don't have to think about that, right? You don't sit around every morning over your coffee saying, hey, Charlie, I was sitting there, I was just wondering, who funds cancer research at the University of Wisconsin Medical School? Nobody has to think about that because sensible human beings are actually getting that done. But I think what's really interesting about this first 4 weeks is what an immense load of bullshit it was to say the Trump restoration are running to get American workers back to work, to a fair deal, economic justice, populism. They don't care about, and this is the most intra-elite fight in the world. When you are pissing on the Kennedy Center and trying to stop universities from charging overhead, you don't give a rat's ass about the average person in Alabama or Indiana. You just don't. That's a very elite thing.
Right. But it's also the kind of thing that will have tangible negative, downstream effects for a very, very long time. The stuff about the pennies and all the other stuff and the talk about Greenland, this is all this, like, tune that out. But if in fact, this step wrecks the research infrastructure of the country, I mean, it's so much easier to break something like that than to put it back together again. And I think how long will it take for people to realize? Oh my! I mean, the fact that Katie Britt, the Republican senator from Alabama, is like, excuse me, you understand that this might actually hurt our universities? Yeah, Katie, what do you think was going to happen when you turned loose the ketamine besotted man-child narcissist billionaire with hammers into your china shop? What did you think was going to happen?
That could be the bumper sticker for the next 4 years. What did you think was going to happen? But the other interesting part of this, Charlie, is the way they can spin it. Yes, there's all these horrible downstream things that they will then explain away. They will say, the deep state and the Democrats and recalcitrant bureaucrats, because while nobody cares about the Kennedy Center or how much universities charge for overhead, they take all that as part of a simpler message. We're sticking it to the pointy heads and the Chardonnay sipping, latte people.
Right.
You don't know. You don't have to know how. We just are. And the way that you know that we're doing something right is by how much howling you can hear from the banks of the Potomac about the Kennedy Center. And I think to go back, I'm still thinking about something you asked earlier about sort of how do we we deal with that, and how do we strain out what's important? I think responding to these things a little more stoically, rather than with a hair on fire, 3 alarm, fire every time. I mean, the Kennedy Center thing is stupid, but the fact that we're talking about it, sort of serves Trump's purpose. Okay, you got control of the Kennedy Center. It's probably not legal. Now can we get back to talking about cancer funding?
Okay, so let's stick with this for a moment, because actually, you got me thinking about something. All right, so Trump's mind is like watching a bag of ferrets. All these things just sort of bouncing around there, and clearly he's easily distracted. You know, somebody comes up to him and says, "Hey, pennies. Hey, Greenland. Hey, all of these things." Whereas, meanwhile, there are people who are, in the bowels of the government doing stuff. And I'm guessing that someone, let's get to it. Let's talk about Elon Musk, the co-president. The people who are actually dismantling the government must kind of like the fact that Trump is so easily distracted. Let him worry about, the gold toilets in the White House and everything, whereas we are, in the Department of the Treasury, in the Social Security Agency, in the Department of Education, in the Defense Department, in the CIA, and doing all of this. So talk to me about this. You had a piece about, Trump and Musk. You're saying they're destroying. Trump and Musk are just. You write this for the Atlantic. Trump and Musk are destroying the basics of a healthy democracy. So, without overusing the term democracy, what is Elon Musk's real goal here? At the end of the day, does he want to be standing amid the rubble of the federal government with the biggest dick in Washington? What is his real goal?
And that my explanation for these guys, for so much of MAGA world, is a psychological explanation rather than a political one.
Mm-hmm.
That these are all, kind of angry misfits who are still mad about high school. I know that's a kind of a blanket, but it's like I think I posted something a long time ago that said it was like something like, the country's gonna be destroyed by people that are still mad about prom night. That there is this kind of, when you ask what's his goal, take the unhappiest, angriest kid you knew in high school and then make him the principal 20 years later, and ask yourself
what Biff from
Biff, right?
Biff. It's like an army of Biffs. Yeah, Back to the Future. Yeah.
And so, there is this kind of, and I wrote about this here, second book plug, in a book called Our Own Worst Enemy. There is this deep, itchy resentment that a lot of Americans have. And you see it in the very, these very prominent Americans who all seem to have some kind of villain or origin story where they felt that they were done dirt earlier in their lives, that they were not given the respect they deserve. I mean, that is Donald Trump's story, right? I mean, nose pressed to the glass about Manhattan.
And daddy issues, yeah.
The whole thing. And I think that, when you look at Hegseth, right? Well, I couldn't be at Biden's inauguration. As one of my friends pointed out, Hegseth started as a kind of, I want to be involved with establishment Republicans. I don't want to get this wrong, but
I vaguely remember that too.
Yeah, I think he was. I think he was kind of gravitating toward Jeb Bush, but if I'm wrong about that, I apologize. But they all had this kind of, we were frozen out by the responsible gatekeepers, so now we're just going to burn it all down. Now we're just going to break everything, because I'll say it again. They are not anti-elitist. They're anti the current elites. They just want to be the new elites. If there are people that voted for this or support the MAGA movement, somehow thinking that like the new elites in Washington are going to be people from, the voters from Oklahoma and Indiana, they're not. This is an intra-beltway fight of the worst kind.
Very much so.
And I think that's the goal. I think Musk is like, I think Musk and a lot of other guys, their goal is to get even in some big cosmic way.
Okay, so I get that. I mean, he's the out of control power, the power grab. I mean, history is full of that. Shakespeare is full of that. We shouldn't actually be shocked, except that the system was set up in such a way, as you mentioned before, that it had guardrails, right? That it had circuit breakers for people like this. That there was once a time when if some unelected billionaire tapped by the executive branch, who was usurping Congress's Article 1 responsibilities, might face some pushback.
Or
So
walked into the
it's one
Treasury
thing that
Department,
yeah,
be escorted right back out.
right. Okay, so the thing that I think the founding fathers, if James Madison was part of our call here, he would be saying, okay, so Tom, what I got wrong was I really thought that there was an inherent sort of the jealousy of the powers, that Congress would never allow itself to have its powers stripped away without a peep. So how do you explain that? Where in history do powerful individuals just basically say, sure, take it. We'd rather be potted plants.
Two
Other
things.
than the
First,
Roman Senate after Caesar. But I mean, I don't want to get into that.
well, I was going to say, I mean, if let's be careful what you ask for in terms of historical analogies, because they're out there. Two things. One is that I'll say this, that Musk and the rest of them, it was very clever of them. And I think that if I were advising them on how to destroy the government, the one thing they did right is their first attack right out of the gate was on an apolitical civil service. To the people who say, look, my oath is to the Constitution. Yes, I work for
that.
Yes, I work for the president. Yes, like, hey, when I was a DoD employee, I walked in the building every day, and every 4 years or 8 years, the portraits changed, right? I mean,
right.
I started working there when Bill Clinton was president. But they went, and that's what I mean about going after the guardrails, because the people call them bureaucrats as a pejorative, but if you think of these
easy target,
they're an easy target, but also an apolitical civil service is really important to a functioning democracy. That that when you go, unlike in more corrupt countries, I mean, I had a lot of experience with Russia. You can't just go into an office building in Russia and do normal government business. I mean, everything is done with influence and who do you know and how is this thing and who did you pay off? We don't do that. So, all right,
we take it for granted then.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, when it's, I mean, how many times have we said when it ends, it'll be like Hemingway's comment about bankruptcy, gradually and then all at once. But the question of why are they doing this? What is the end purpose here? I think so much of it is just venality. If you get past the psychological explanations of getting even, there's a kind of venality and a sense that nothing, and this is, I think with foreign affairs especially, this bothers me, a sense that nothing really matters. Like nothing can really go bad. Nothing can really go wrong. That there are really serious consequences for this. You've talked about these major downstream effects. I don't think anybody there now,
well,
really
they don't worry about the downstream effects of treating our allies like this. I mean, so whatever happens this week or next week with Canada and Mexico and China, what's happening will have long-term effects, right? It changes, in a negotiation, you may, have the binary I win, you lose, on day one, but by day 10, people have adjusted, right? I mean, they're not going to go back to all this. So let's stick with this thing with the guardrails and Vance, because the big question that's hanging out there, I think today, and I talked about this with David French the other day, was what happens if Donald Trump just ignores the courts? And it appears that they are gearing up to do this. I just want to, and over the weekend, JD Vance tweeted out, if judges, interfered with, the president's duties, it would be illegal. So this is something that he's been talking about for years. Goes back to 2021. Here's an interview he gave to a podcaster. He said, I think Trump is going to run again in 2024. I think that what Trump should do, if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. Then this, and when the courts stop you, because that's illegal, and when the courts stop you, he went on, stand before the country and say, quoting Andrew Jackson, giving a challenge to the constitutional order, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Okay, so there's a clear signal that he has been percolating this idea that we could ignore the court. And then he had this interesting quote that is often cut out of this. He then explained, we are in a late Republican period. If we're going to push back against it, we're going to have to get pretty wild and pretty far out there. And this is kind of considered to be a reference to, this right-wing view of America as Rome waiting for Caesar. Well, you know what happened in late Republican Rome? It fell. The Republic fell, and it became an empire. I just threw this out. But let's talk about this. So, Tom, I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration is gearing up to basically say to the Supreme Court, nice rule of law you have there. Wouldn't it be a shame if you gave us a ruling that would force us to expose the fact that your power is just a bluff?
Yeah, you dragged Mr. Madison into this, and the ultimate guardrail, Madison's ultimate guardrail, was the inherent decency of the American public. When he said,
that's right.
When he was asked, how do we prevent these jealous, power seekers? And he said, if there is no virtue among us, then we are in a wretched condition. And I think that's partly where we are, because, J.D. Vance went to Yale Law School. He knows better than this. Yeah, I mean, he knows that when he says, well, judge it. I mean, unless he doesn't, in which case he was just a bad law student. But he knows that there's a difference between courts serving as a check on the executive and courts trying to manage executive functions, which no one is not the issue here. When the court says you can't just erase the 14th Amendment, that's not the court's micromanaging executive business. That's the court's, saying we interpret the Constitution. You said he'll go to the Supreme Court. He won't have to go to the Supreme. The courts he'll defy are at lower levels, and then the Supreme Court's. I suspect the Supreme Court will give him a Jedi mind trick, hand wave of this is fine.
Okay, so I engaged in some rank speculation in my Monday newsletter, and this is just me, riffing on all of this. But I wrote about Korematsu 2.0. And this is one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. It's the decision in 1944 where the court upheld the internment of Japanese citizens who were living on the West Coast. It is ranked right there with Dred Scott, Plessy, as just one of the worst decisions ever made, that you would create these massive detention centers. And by the way, we kind of memory hold that, that one of Franklin Roosevelt's legacies was to create.
I was just going to say that, Charlie.
Camps. Yeah, there's concentration camps with just the Japanese, and when
you and I were Republicans, and people would say, "You Republicans, the worst racists, you're going to set up concentration camps." So, you just kind of meekly raise your hand and say, "Excuse me, it's been done already."
This has happened. Well, so Trump is sending 30,000 migrants to camps in Guantanamo Bay, where we used to send Al Qaeda prisoners. And first of all, that's like a black hole. Will they have any access? The media will be able to see them and everything. That's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. So I wrote there are two, I think, but there's a lot of different options, but two really bad ones. Number one, that the conservative majority says, yeah, absolutely. We're going to basically apply the same kind of logic that we applied back in 1944 in the worst decision ever in the 20th century, and say that, yes, you can have massive concentration camps in Gitmo for migrants. They might uphold that. Or two, they might say, no, sorry, we're not going to give another Korematsu decision. We're going to tell the administration this is illegal and unconstitutional. And Trump says basically, fuck you. I'm going to ignore you. And says to Justice Roberts, okay, you do something about it. You and the justices fly down to Gitmo. You fly down to Cuba and bring them home. Either way, you get the sense that we're on this collision course.
And Gitmo's a great example.
History may not rhyme exactly there between those two cases. I get there are differences, but I think they may not be exactly, but the rhyme is unmistakable. Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, and Gitmo. The difference, of course, being Korematsu was worse, because these were American citizens. Again, which people just, the memory holding of Korematsu really was always a pebble in my shoe during these arguments back in the before times when we still had partisan arguments about the parties and race. But the scary part of this is let's go down the Gitmo road, which is the Supreme Court says you can't do this. Those migrants have to be released. Well, who's holding them? U.S. military, right? So Trump says, okay, you've made your decision. I'm not issuing that order to the Pentagon.
Right. Yeah.
And now then you have America's military leadership saying, Supreme Court has clearly said, do this thing. The commander in chief says, I'm not going to do this thing. Now, I think the default for them is to say, well, until somebody straightens that out, we follow the orders of the commander in chief. But, if Trump just says, okay, noted, thank you. There were supposedly, not supposedly, actually, when Richard Nixon was vetoing the War Powers Act, apparently it was Robert Bork. This is the part I'm not clear. I think it was Bork who wanted to add a note that said, we should just send this back to Congress with a note that says, thank you for your essay on my constitutional powers. When I have time, I will send you an essay on yours. Now, with the War Powers Act, that was not an immediate, there was no forcing function. There was nothing actually, Vietnam was just about over. Nixon vetoed it. His veto was overridden, and presidents have lived with it ever since. But imagine this situation where the Supreme Court says, the U.S. military must release these people and transport them out of Gitmo. And Donald Trump says, only one person give that order, and I'm not going to give it. Well, then, as you say, it's a collision course. What do you do? And I think Trump and the rest of them don't care.
Yeah, no, they don't care. In fact, I think they would like to flex that muscle.
Yeah, so almost as if to say, please give us a ruling where the president can sit back and tent his fingers and say, I'm not going to do that.
I think, and MAGA would rally around him, and Republicans in Congress would rally around him, and it would play out the way so many of these have. Okay, so Tom, you and I basically spent 2024 doing pretty much the same thing. Okay, waving flags, sending off flares, issuing warnings. You had a cover story in The Atlantic, as I recall, in October. What was the headline again?
November. Yep, but it's called The Moment of Truth.
All right.
It was about George Washington and how far we've fallen, and that Donald Trump is the guy that Washington and the founders were worried about.
And so I've argued, and see whether you agree, everything that could have been said about Donald Trump was said. Every warning was issued. The public had no excuses. This campaign did not conceal Donald Trump. This campaign was Donald Trump in full all of the time, right? So, Tom, we haven't talked since the election. What happened? The American people is presented with this man, the historical context, the personal context, him at his worst, and they chose to put him back in the White House. What happened?
Not just the people who chose to vote for him affirmatively, but the millions of Democrats who shrugged their shoulders and stayed home. I never want to hear again about the resistance and the, existential, emergency and all that. I mean, a lot of people just stayed home. And I think that was a triumph of the flood the zone with shit strategy.
Is it a failure on our part that we weren't talking to the right people?
I think that overestimates our importance. Not that I'm ever reluctant to overestimate my own importance, but
I mean, all the warnings. What I'm saying, I mean, all the people who were issuing the warnings. Was it just fan service for the already converted? Did we not get those warnings, or did people just not give a shit about the warnings?
A lot of people just didn't believe it, Charlie. I mean, I keep telling this story about three or 4 days before the election. I was in Pennsylvania, and I was with Heather Cox Richardson doing a talk in Pennsylvania, and when it was all over, went back, go to the airport. I get on the plane, and it turned the person next to me is a all out full, like the way, it's kind of like the old joke about atheists and vegetarians on the internet. How do you know they're there? Because they will tell you. They will be sure to tell you. This woman, within 10 minutes of sitting down, had already tried to suss out my politics, and started to, she, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a writer. I said, I used to be a college professor and writer. She said, oh, you must be one of those Harris liberals. And I was like, okay, it's going to be a long flight. But
That's why you
the
bring
reason I'm talking
headphones,
about is that when I
the big
brought up,
noise canceling headphones, Tom.
but I
Seriously?
was fascinated. I mean, it was a fascinating discussion, and one I've had multiple times over the
Mhm.
past 3 or 4 years, where I kept saying that, and I'll give you one example because it's very timely right now. I said, so you support? Oh yeah, I think he's done great things. He did, the economy and so on. I said, so you're looking forward to tariffs again? And she said, oh, he's not going to do that. Like with this absolute certainty, he's not going to do that. And I said, he did it the first time.
Oh
She
yeah.
looked at me and she said, he did. And this was a business owner, by the way. I don't want to be too, Pennsylvania is not that big. It's a big place. It's not that big a place. It was a Western Pennsylvania business owner. And I said, yes, don't you remember, bailing out the farmers and the billions of dollars and she was like, well, I don't recall that, but it's not going to happen again. Now, you can warn people until you're blue in the face, but that really does become the leopards eating faces problem, where you just say, these leopards eat people's faces. Yeah, no, it's not mine, not me, not really a leopard, not really an aggressive. I mean, it's just there are all these defense mechanisms. And I think if you're asking the big question about how did this happen, people decided beforehand who to vote for when it came to Trump. That's like, I can't vote for Kamala Harris. She's too liberal, too female, too black, too California, whatever reason. So I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. And they start there and then reverse engineer all the reasons.
The rationalization, the pretexts, all of that, because it is the way you're describing is a certain elasticity of mind that will take everything you like and say he will do it, everything you don't like and say he won't do it, and that really shows up, I think, in a lot of the coverage.
And it requires you to kind of delete everything you once knew, or to simply say none of that matters. He doesn't really mean the Canada thing is so perfect, Charlie, because it's another perfect Trump moment, right? Where he comes out and says, hey, I have this crazy idea. And speaking of Atlantic pieces, an idea so crazy that I pointed out that it was the plot of a 1965 book about a crazy president. Right? Same thing.
Was that
take over Canada?
Night of Camp David, right?
Right. Written by the same guy who did 7 Days in May.
Okay, so I want to say I went back and I read that book, and in comparison to what's actually happening, it's pretty mild. You're supposed to know the guy has completely lost his mind. I'm sorry.
and actually, what the guy's talking about in Night of Camp David almost makes more sense than what Trump is saying right now.
I know,
but he comes out and he says this, and then right away, right, the MAGA machine goes and says, oh, you didn't really mean, he means, and it's a negotiating ploy and it's a tactic and it's just a thing. And Trump, and then what does he do? He sits down and he says, no, I really mean it. Yeah. And this, every time they defend something outrageous that Trump says, he pulls the rug out from under his own people. But their answer, Charlie, could be, okay, you're right. What difference does it make? We still win. Yeah. People don't hold us responsible for it. We win elections. Nobody cares.
Yeah, I think that's also been internalized. Okay, so at the risk of switching back to a much graver topic, and maybe I probably should have led with this this time. The one thing that Trump did so many of the things that he said he was going to do, including the January 6th partners. I do feel that I'm letting down America every time I don't mention the fact that he pardoned the people who rioted, tried to stop the election and attack cops, because that still has, was one of the, should be considered one of the most appalling decisions ever. But so he did it on day one.
I thought he would pardon some of them. I didn't think.
I did too.
I think the quote was, he said, fuck it, right? Just like it was too complicated for him to figure out who was, he says, okay, fuck it, pardon them all. Which is
reassuring in itself, right? Yeah, you can
sort of say, like, somebody in the White House would say, hey,
they probably
that's a bad idea.
Okay, so this is we're living in the fuck it presidency era. Like, is he going to go, okay, so which vaccine should we ban? Fuck it, let's ban them all. Which country should we nuke? Just fuck them all. Who knows? Okay, so what he did not do on day one was end the war in Ukraine. and we still don't have a resolution. He said that he would be able to do it with a single phone call. I think the expectation, the fear, my fear was that he would. I still fear that he will sell out Ukraine, that he will hand Vladimir Putin a massive victory. But we're in week 4. Where are we at? Is Ukraine hanging by a thread? What do you think?
Interestingly, I think the Europeans and the Biden administration front-loaded some of this so that they, that despite Trump's attack on bureaucrats, there are things that you just can't stop, overnight. But interestingly, there's been no movement. There's been no discussion. When's the last time you heard about a readout of a call with Xi or Putin at this point? Yeah. I mean, it is all focused on internal revenge politics. It's almost like the external world doesn't exist. And I keep going back to Hegseth at defense. Nothing about the challenges we face in the world. It's all about making sure federal employees go back to the office.
Okay, but what are the Russians thinking? What are the Russians thinking? Well, the Russians and the Chinese, they are watching what you and I are watching. What do they see? Do they see chaos? Do they see opportunity? Do they see what do they see?
I think they can't believe their dumb luck.
Yeah. So what do they do with that dumb luck? So what do they do?
Well, in the 1970s, let me put on my scholarly hat from my old professor days. In the 1970s, when the United States, I mean, think about where we were by the late 1970s. We'd been through a president that nobody elected. Yeah. And then, knocked out of office by a Southern governor nobody had heard of, whose foreign policy was kind of, whipsawing back and forth from left to right.
Yeah, for you young people, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Gerald Ford, yes. Gerald Ford, one of the best presidents that America ever had that nobody ever elected. And the Soviets at that time, if you look at the memoirs and the documentary record, they said in later years, we basically acted as if the United States didn't exist. We were able to act in places like Africa and the Middle East as if the United States just didn't exist. We didn't have to take into account what Washington thought about anything. And I think that's where they're going to go with this, because they realize that Trump can be so easily manipulated, so easily whipsawed about, with praise or shiny objects. I think one reason you haven't heard anything about Ukraine, Charlie, is that he's just not, he's outsourced it. I mean, I don't know what Keith Kellogg is doing right now. I don't know what the Ukraine shop is doing right now. I don't know who's running this stuff. And I don't think anybody in the administration knows who's running this stuff.
So maybe it's because this is a hard decision. It's complicated, and he is going for all the easy stuff right now.
Yeah.
Or if it's not easy, he's letting Elon handle it or somebody else. He's not actually doing any of the complicated, hard stuff. He's going through every single piece of low-hanging fruit I'm going to mix the metaphor, so that he can throw the red meat to the MAGA base without, and the less complexity, the better. The simpler the idea, the better.
Get even with his opponents, stick it to the Americans who didn't vote for him or didn't support him or criticized him. Everything is focused inward at this point. And none of it, by the way, on that, and we talked about this a minute ago, none of it on the agenda of what was I'm going to lower prices. I'm going to, make eggs. Yeah. Hey, we haven't heard anything about eggs, and eggs have gotten really pretty expensive because of.
He was asked about that by Brett Baer of the Super Bowl interview. Did you catch that? And he changed it about lowering the cost of living, and he changed the subject immediately. So right. Yeah,
but that's because, and this is where I think when you were talking about messaging earlier, it doesn't matter. His voters have decided that he has to be in office and that they can't climb down. This is something I've been saying for 8 years. They are like kittens at the top of that tree. They can't climb back down. They don't know how to get out of it. And so when he says, I'm going to end the war and slash price of eggs, and then it doesn't happen, they say, well, he just says stuff. He's busy. He's doing the right things. He's making the right people mad. Interestingly, we talked about Gaza. I'll end the war in Ukraine and get us out of all these crazy foreign entanglements. Well, except for occupying one of the most controversial hotspots on the planet right now.
Yeah.
you know,
Which we've just ethnically cleansed.
which,
I think he
well,
said, and the Palestinians couldn't come back. So.
right. Saying yesterday, I mean, an American president saying yesterday, let's have America take over Gaza,
Yeah.
ethnically cleanse its residents so that they can't come back. And, and again, he's gotten everyone so used to this that the collective response around the country has been, well, what are you going to do?
The collective response.
He says a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, the collective response of the American people the day after the President of the United States called for ethnically cleansing a people and taking it over is, hey, wasn't it cool that he tweeted that thing about Taylor Swift being booed at Super Bowl, which I guess once again is an indication of something you have written in the past. We've talked about the bottom of this. We are a deeply unserious nation at this particularly very serious moment, aren't we? I mean, it's like, on the one hand, we are faced with these incredibly serious problems, and yet the American people are unserious. And Donald Trump, though, and I don't want to give him too much credit because it's that reptilian instinct, he gets it, which is why so much of the shit that he throws out is unserious, because that's what unserious people just eat up.
I've said this so many times. It's what they want.
Yeah.
And when I say they, I don't just mean Trump's voters. I mean, I was thinking back. I used to teach this course on nuclear weapons, and I would show my students the Reagan TV address where he did Star Wars, right? Where he said, free people could live safe in the knowledge. Remember that? It was March 83.
I do.
A big deal. But I said, more to the point, imagine an American president scheduling 30 minutes of TV time on all the major networks with charts and graphs and pictures and, bar graphs and numbers. You wouldn't be able to, it's just, people would just turn it off. I mean, the idea that the president could speak to the American people, whether you like Ronald Reagan or not, he goes out and he says, I'm going to take 30 minutes of prime time on the national networks to explain what's going on with strategic nuclear weapons. And people watched it. You cannot get that level of seriousness. And I think when you bring up the late Roman phase, there's another word. We are not just an unserious people. There's a kind of decadence that has set in that comes from affluence and leisure. And, look, Neil Postman, I'd like to think I wrote a couple of good books. Neil Postman said it 40 years ago. We are amusing ourselves to death. We can't have serious conversations like adults.
And when people say, well, how do we turn this around? Well, we are a culture, as you say, with you're not serious. When you go from not reading books, not reading articles, getting all your information from TikTok and YouTube, on YouTube, and from 280 character social media posts, I think it has an effect on the way that people process information and where they reason, which is, a topic for another day, Mr. Nichols, because I know you have to go and write some amazing things. And so I really enjoy your stuff in the Atlantic. Keep it up. It is good to see at least one outlet that continues to have enough confidence in the American mind that it writes lucid, literate, intelligent things, as opposed to, I think what has been flooding the zone. So thank you for joining me, Tom. I appreciate it very, very much.
My pleasure, Charlie. It's good to see you again. And
thank you all for listening to the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back later this week and do this all